Late at night, in the heart of a small, quiet town, one sight had become almost routine for the locals. Every evening, a young black girl could be seen at the old laundromat on Main Street. She would sit there, alone, surrounded by piles of clothes, her eyes focused on the spinning machines. To some, she seemed out of place, a child spending hours in a laundromat well past her bedtime. To others, she was simply a curious mystery. One night, the local sheriff, a man known for his dedication to the community, happened to pass by the laundromat during his late patrol. He noticed her again, sitting in the corner, head bowed, seemingly lost in thought. The sight tugged at his heart. Why was she there every single night? Where were her parents? The questions lingered as he parked his car and approached the building. The moment he stepped inside, he was greeted by the hum of the machines and the girl's quiet, watchful eyes. She looked up at him, startled, as if she had been caught in the middle of something she wasn't supposed to be doing. What he discovered next would shake him to his core. It wasn't just the girl's presence in the laundromat that brought him to tears. It was the heartbreaking truth behind why she was there in the first place. Stay with us as we uncover the story that changed not only the sheriff's life, but an entire community's perspective. What secret was this little girl carrying? And how did it bring a town together? As the sheriff stood in the doorway, he couldn't help but notice how worn out the girl looked. Her clothes were clean but slightly oversized, as if they'd been borrowed or handed down. Her small hands clutched a tattered backpack, and she glanced nervously at the door, as though expecting someone to barge in at any moment. The air felt heavy with unspoken words, and for a brief second, the sheriff hesitated. He didn't want to scare her off, but he knew something wasn't right. He approached her slowly, speaking in the calm, reassuring tone he used with his own kids. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you all right? It's pretty late for you to be here all alone." She didn't answer at first, just shifted uncomfortably in her chair and looked down at her shoes. "I'm waiting," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Waiting for what?" The sheriff pressed gently. Her silence only deepened the mystery. He noticed her eyes darting toward the corner of the laundromat, where a large blanket lay folded on top of a dryer. It was almost like she didn't want him to look too closely. The sheriff's mind raced. Why was she here? Was she in danger? Was someone forcing her to stay? He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about laundry. The laundromat wasn't exactly a safe haven, especially at this hour. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Something told him that tonight, he was about to uncover a story much bigger than he could have imagined. A story of hardship, resilience, and an unimaginable burden carried by someone so young. The sheriff's curiosity grew stronger, but so did the knot in his stomach. He pulled up a chair and sat a few feet away from the girl, giving her space while still trying to bridge the gap between them. "Is there someone I can call for you?" "Your parents, maybe," he asked, his voice steady but warm. Her hands gripped the straps of her backpack tighter, and she shook her head without meeting his eyes. "No," she said firmly. There was something in her tone, a mixture of fear and determination, that made it clear she didn't want to say more. As the minutes ticked by, the sheriff couldn't help but notice the details around him. The blanket on the dryer, the small pile of snacks peeking out of her backpack, and the way her sneakers looked just a little too big. It dawned on him that this laundromat wasn't just a place she visited, it was where she lived. He tried a different approach. "You know, I see you here a lot. You must have a good reason for spending so much time in this place," he said softly, hoping she'd trust him. Her eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment, it seemed like she might open up. But then the door creaked open behind them, and her whole body tensed. The sheriff turned to see who had entered, but it was just an elderly man dropping off a load of laundry. The girl visibly relaxed, but only slightly. Something, or someone, had her constantly on edge. He realized he needed to tread carefully. Whatever she was hiding, it was bigger than anything he'd expected. And as the storm outside picked up, the sheriff made a silent promise. He wasn't leaving this laundromat without understanding her story. The sheriff stayed silent for a moment, letting the sound of the rain against the windows fill the space. He could feel the weight of the girl's unspoken story pressing down on them both. She glanced at the door again, her gaze darting nervously to the clock on the wall. Whatever she was waiting for, or avoiding, seemed to be drawing closer. "Look, I'm not here to get you in trouble," the sheriff said gently. "But I need to know if you're safe. If someone's hurting you, I can help." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, her face softened. Then just as quickly, her defenses snapped back into place. "No one's hurting me," she said, but her voice wavered. The sheriff didn't believe her, not entirely. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the laundromat was plunged into brief darkness before the fluorescent glow returned. The girl flinched, clutching her backpack like it was her only shield. The sheriff could feel her fear, but he didn't know its source. Then faintly, over the sound of the storm, they both heard it, a car engine outside. Her reaction was immediate. She froze, her eyes wide with panic, and slid off her chair as if to hide. The sheriff stood, his hand instinctively brushing the holster on his belt. "Who's out there?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pressed herself against the wall, her small frame trembling. The sheriff turned toward the door, his pulse quickening. Someone or something was coming. And whatever it was, it seemed to hold the key to the mystery that had kept this little girl in the laundromat night after night. The sheriff stepped closer to the door, peering out through the rain-streaked glass. A dark sedan idled just outside, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the laundromat floor. The engine rumbled steadily, but no one got out. The girl stayed glued to the wall, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "Do you know who that is?" the sheriff asked, his voice calm but edged with urgency. She hesitated, then shook her head, but her eyes told a different story. There was recognition in them, fearful, reluctant recognition. The sheriff turned back to the car, his hand hovering near his radio. Something felt off. It wasn't just the odd timing or the girl's reaction. It was the way the car sat there, like it was waiting for something or someone. Then the driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out, dressed in a dark jacket, his face obscured by the hood pulled low over his head. He didn't look toward the laundromat, but instead walked slowly to the trunk. The sheriff's instincts screamed at him to act, but he held his ground, watching as the man rummaged through the trunk before pulling out a small, nondescript bag. Inside, the girl let out a soft whimper. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "don't let him take me." The sheriff's heart sank. "Take you?" he asked, his tone sharp with concern. But before she could answer, the man outside slammed the trunk shut, the noise echoing through the night. He turned and began walking toward the laundromat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The sheriff stepped in front of the girl, his protective instincts kicking in. The tension in the air was palpable, and the girl's trembling only made it worse. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear. This was no ordinary night, and the truth was about to come crashing down. The sheriff planted his feet firmly, blocking the man's path as he entered the laundromat. The hooded figure stopped just inside the door, the bag dangling loosely in his hand. His face was partially shadowed, but the sheriff caught a glimpse of cold, calculating eyes. "Evening," the sheriff said, his voice steady but laced with authority. "What brings you here so late?" The man didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted past the sheriff to the girl, who shrank back further against the wall. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I'm here to pick her up. She's my niece." The sheriff glanced back at the girl, who shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with desperation. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't even know him." The man smirked, his expression growing colder. "She's confused. Been through a lot, hasn't she?" He took a step forward, but the sheriff held up a hand to stop him. "Not another step," the sheriff warned. "If she's your niece, you'll have no problem showing me proof." "Got any ID? Legal papers?" The man's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, and the sheriff saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes. Before he could respond, the girl found her voice, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's not my uncle. He's the reason I'm here. He's been following me ever since I ran away." The sheriff's blood ran cold. "Ran away from what?" he asked, but the girl couldn't answer before the man lunged for her. The sheriff reacted instantly, pulling the man back and pinning him to the floor. The bag he carried spilled open, revealing cash, fake IDs, and other suspicious items. It became clear this wasn't about family. This was about something far darker. As the sheriff radioed for backup, the girl's story finally spilled out. She had escaped a dangerous situation at home, only to find herself preyed upon by someone exploiting her vulnerability. The laundromat had become her sanctuary, a place where she could hide while figuring out her next move. When the man was taken into custody, the girl looked at the sheriff, her eyes filled with tears, not just of fear, but of relief. "Thank you," she said softly. But just as the tension began to ease, a final twist emerged. Among the man's belongings was a photograph of another child, with a note scribbled on the back. Asterisk next target asterisk, the sheriff realized this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, more sinister network. The night had revealed not just the girl's resilience, but also a chilling truth that would spark a deeper investigation. What started as a quiet patrol had become the beginning of a fight against something far greater than anyone in that small town could have imagined. As the sheriff stood in the now quiet laundromat, the storm outside began to ease, but the weight of what had unfolded still lingered. The girl sat nearby, bundled in a blanket one of the deputies had brought. Her hands cradled a cup of hot cocoa, and for the first time that night, her shoulders seemed to relax. The man who had haunted her nights was in custody, and the sheriff's team had already started digging deeper into the evidence. It was clear this wasn't the end of the story, but it was the start of something important. The sheriff promised himself that he would see this investigation through and do whatever it took to protect others like her. As dawn broke, the girl finally began to share more of her story. She explained how she'd run from a home where she didn't feel safe, seeking refuge wherever she could. The laundromat had become her hiding place, a spot where she felt invisible and, for a while, safe. She'd been trying to figure out her next move when the man appeared, threatening to turn her life upside down again. The sheriff arranged for her to stay with a local family who opened their doors to kids in need. The warmth and kindness they offered were a far cry from the cold, lonely nights she'd spent in the laundromat. Before she left, she turned to the sheriff and said, "You didn't just stop him. You gave me hope again." As he watched her drive away with the family, the sheriff felt a quiet sense of purpose. Sometimes the smallest actions, stopping to ask a question, listening, could make all the difference. In that moment, he knew this wasn't just about justice. It was about giving someone a second chance at life.